Hello and welcome back to the channel. I'm Dan, and this is Forlorn Hobbies.
Hello and welcome back to the channel. Now, today I'm thinking about terrain. Now, for the last couple of months, I've been working on some terrain pieces for an event at the end of this month. And with work and life getting in the way, it's led to me having a lot more time than I'd wanted to kind of think about the process rather than actually doing the process. So it's kind of led me down a thought rabbit hole, so to speak, on like the kind of role that terrain plays within this hobby that we enjoy. So I thought, what better than to just kind of throw out my thoughts and kind of thinking process of this and see if you agree or disagree in the comments. Now, in my time in this hobby over many, many years, my kind of opinion of terrain within the hobby has drastically changed. Now, it was probably the sole thing that was responsible in me stopping as a small child in the shop window of the local Games Workshop on my high street when I was a child, seeing this great big dynamic wizard's tower that was built for an intro game for fantasy. And it was that intimidating kind of but inspiring kind of aesthetic that really made me stop and go, oh, I want to look at this. And I think if I hadn't had seen that or it, gone past it, I don't think I would have been as motivated to kind of want to explore the hobby that has consumed a lot of my spare time over the years. But that aside, I always saw terrain as something that was in the shop, at events that you went to. It wasn't something that I ever really played with or like thought about making myself, because I didn't feel like I had the skills or anything to kind of match what I'd seen in that kind of, should we say, professional environment. Now, of course, that didn't mean that I didn't do any kind of gaming at home, but I'm sure we were all there at one point or another where we would just put a video cassette box down and go, that's a hill, or have a book as a hill under a blanket or something, just to kind of create elevation. Put cardboard boxes down and just be like, right, that's a building, to give you a kind of barrier within the game rather than actually looking at the aesthetics and kind of immersion aspect of it. So that leads me kind of to my first point, that terrain in a gaming system has always been about adding kind of line of sight barriers, elements of defense and benefits, or even kind of that strategical purpose of having to capture something that you don't really think about the aesthetic. Now, obviously, from the hobby side of things, you want immersion. And I don't think anything is as successful as giving you that immersion in the setting of the game than the terrain. So it's kind of both ends of the scale, really. You've got practical ability where just you need barriers and blocks in the game, and then you've got a really detailed kind of immersive setting at the other end of the spectrum. And I think my hobby journey, like most of yours, has kind of swung kind of like a pendulum between those two elements throughout my journey. Now, that's purely from like the gaming perspective of it. Now, rules these days always focus in and have rules for different types of terrain, which adds that extra level of depth and flavor to the game, whether it's siege games or even just rivers, woods. They all have a practical purpose. So if you're playing in a competitive game, you must have certain types of terrain and a specified amount on the board. Now, this is often kind of not destroyed the immersion for me, but it kind of makes light of it where this is practical and you have very little need for creativity when it comes to terrain from a rules perspective. Now, a good example that I can think of from my own experiences, I went to a Horus Heresy event many years ago now, and we had, because it was a narrative event, we had like kind of thoughtful, well presented terrain that kind of gave it good immersion, but the competitive 40k terrain in the next room was literally bits of polystyrene as line of block sites and L-shaped buildings with very little hobby effort in, because they just had to have not mirrored tables but set tables on a large scale. So it was just almost akin to like a kind of just industrial churn out of blocks that were like, right, that'll do. And there was very little character on the boards. Now, that's completely fine from a gaming perspective, but since then, those types of rule sets have gone more and more to just the practicalities rather than like you have to have L-shaped ruins. You can't have imaginative ruins with versatile kits like you used to have. For example, I think the first proper terrain project that I really did was making some Heresy era ruins from the old like Cities of Death 40k kits that were very versatile, and I think I made about a dozen different buildings from 3 kits that are very large and very unique for that game. Whereas now you buy a building, it's in a fixed position, there's very little room. I mean, there is ways to be creative with it, but you have to go outside the box to be creative rather than just having infinite possibilities from the kit itself. Now, on the other end of the scale, and that I often enjoy attending wargaming events and shows like Partisan, for example, where the first thing that will always catch your eye is the incredible effort that many hobbyists put in to putting on their kind of showcase games with absolutely stunning scratch-built terrain that the game is then centered around. So like you take a historical siege, they'll build that castle, they'll look at maps, they'll try and recreate every little detail, which just blows my mind every time I see something new. And just thinking about it kind of later on, just thinking about the amount of effort that has had to have gone into that project purely for that one scenario, means you have so much dedication to this hobby, as opposed to going along the route where, I could just chuck a house here, or I'll chuck a house there, and a wall here, because that's what the game requires. So I think where I sit at the moment is much more towards the immersive side when it comes to terrain, but I always kind of factor in, when I'm making something, the practicality of the gaming experience from that game. Now, at the moment, I'm working on some built up areas for Black Powder. And when it comes to buildings in Black Powder, the rules are quite strong. It's very hard to dislodge units from a building because of the static res and the save increases. So when it comes to representing villages or towns on the tabletop, like, one of our house rules is we kind of, instead of having 4 different buildings on a crossroads, for example, we will amalgamate it into a built up area, which then means it can look like it's supposed to on the tabletop with the multitude of buildings, but from a gaming perspective, it can only be occupied by 1 unit at a time, which then aids the flow of the game instead of creating massive kind of tar pits that, because of the proximity, unintentionally sour the experience of the game when you lose a lot more than you should have to take a single building. Now, in terms of creating terrain for myself, I would always kind of look for plastic kits to begin with, and I still do, because there are many fantastic plastic terrain companies. There's resin FDM printers out there now with stunning ranges, and terrain is always evolving in that sense. But scratch building allows you to have that creativity that you want to have in your hobby. It adds an extra element, whether it's just painting something or adding depth to an MDF kit that you want to add more dimension and character to. Really kind of building something that is unique to you. Now, there are channels out there. I mean, I'm a massive fan of Zorbazork with his Middle-earth terrain, which is obscenely crazy in like the scale and scope of what he does. But it's that kind of passion and drive that really highlights, the role that terrain has within the hobby in general. And that's something that I think really helps in our overall enjoyment, where, I enjoy painting my miniatures, but sometimes having that change to a different army or project isn't enough. I need to kind of scale it back, change it, allow a bit more creativity, and jumping into a terrain project or two really helps kind of balance that flow of like kind of positive energy to my hobby process. Now, obviously, a very big drawback to that is the space that terrain tends to take up. And I have so many ideas in my head that I would love nothing more than to be able to do, but they're non-starters because I do not have the space to kind of store or even work on these massive kind of projects. I think one of the main kind of thoughts in my head was looking through the Black Powder rulebook. There's a couple of scenarios in it that I would really love to play and do a board for, maybe even take to shows and display. But just the size of that board that I'd need to do, I need to think about the logistics of storing, etc., which is a kind of the boring admin stuff, so to speak. And 9 times out of 10, it's, I don't actually have an answer to that. And so instead, I kind of look at trying to make things that I can drop onto a table that take up a lot less space than a board. So the monastery or chapel that I did recently for my Peninsular War kind of games is an example of that, where I've kind of compromised on not building the whole board out, but have looked for things that I can do as mini. I mean, it's very large, but kind of in the scale of things, quite a small project that gives me that kind of satisfaction in that area and kind of compromise mentally, so that I still can have that immersive experience in those games, but not have to store a 8x6 board every time I want to change my kind of gaming setting. Now, I think one of the biggest barriers to kind of making your own terrain, excluding the kind of obviously the huge availability that is out there for pre-made kits and plastic kits, printing, etc., is that it's quite hard to know where to begin sometimes. Now, as I said, I've always kind of either played in stores or kind of not really thought too much about terrain. But it wasn't until I purchased the Song of Ice and Fire game that had come out that I really started to think about making my own terrain. Because now, I don't want this to sound like a criticism, because I actually think it's a very good way of having, kind of from a gaming perspective, the terrain available to you. But in the starter sets, they would come out with like kind of picturized card cutouts of woodland terrain, rocky outcrops, etc., that you could place down on the battlefield and treat as an area of cover or terrain, but without that kind of three-dimensional immersion that you would get from playing on a standardized terrain. And the purpose behind that was accessibility, storage, etc. And it was a uniformed size for trees, terrain, so it could be put into events, etc., without any hassle. Now, I looked at it and I went, I like this idea, but what I didn't like was the immersion kind of gaping hole of, absence of that. So I thought to myself, you know what, I'm going to give it a crack and just make some simple terrain, and that based on the sizes of the area of terrain for the game. So I got the cardboard cutouts, I traced around them onto some basing material, like some MDF sheets, and cut them out, and then made simple woodland bases and some rocky outcrops. And I was not overly optimistic, but I thought I would challenge myself, and I was pleasantly surprised with the outcome. And there are pieces that I still use to this day in my games. So, in fact, you've probably seen them in some of my videos where I've got the trees and woodlands in the background, just to add that kind of bit of depth to the scene that I'm trying to give. And it didn't really take much effort. It was like a couple of bits of pieces here and there. I think I went out into my garden and found some bits of slate that could make as good alternatives to that jaggy outcrops, a bit of household filler, some sand, basing materials, etc. And a couple of evenings' work, I was very happy with the results. And from that point, I don't think I've really looked back. I've always kind of trusted my thought process and allowed my creativity to kind of flow naturally. Now, there are obviously some compromises that you have to make going on, like whether you want to look at the time it takes to just build a MDF kit or scratch build something. So at the moment, I'm doing some built up areas, as I said, for the event, and it's very much my kind of input on that is to kind of add a little bit more depth to MDF kits and as a whole, as opposed to just scratch building everything, because unfortunately I do not have the time to do it on that kind of scale. But it's certainly something I want to do more of in the future going forwards. But also, making your own terrain doesn't have to be a huge undertaking. It can just be something simple, like making some barrels and some chests to have some scatter terrain for your games, to crazy big projects like you see on Zorps, or building huge castles. Now, I would love to make much more terrain, and I've got loads of ideas that might see the light of day depending on their practicality, but it doesn't have to just be terrain for the tabletop for gaming. You know, that part of this hobby is to make dioramas or display boards. Now, display boards are a growing thing at many events that I attend, and the level of activity there just blows my mind. So it's kind of added that extra element to my thought process when planning an army, specifically for Middle Earth and the events that I attend. I think my thought process in that is, what army would I like for theme? What kind of display board can I make for it? And then think about the list itself and kind of how it all interacts to create that kind of visual story narrative that you want to create in that circumstance. So I'm hoping that I'll be able to document that kind of process a bit more when I get round to doing my next tournament army for Middle Earth, and kind of really make a kind of go at it going forwards. So kind of coming towards the end of this kind of rambling of terrain, I think the best thing for it is to find that balance on the pendulum between playability and immersion by looking at the visual aesthetic of it, but also don't be kind of intimidated to just give it a go and do something that you want to do. It's all about trial and error. You're going to always get things wrong, like with painting, but you're always going to learn from that process. And I think it will give you a much more positive, all-round hobby experience if you can take that jump and get an extra level of enjoyment out of your hobby by maybe doing something that you haven't done before. Now, when we're playing games, it's the thought process. You know, you don't just rock up unless it's an event, put your stuff down. You have that extra level of thinking about terrain, like the placement, the visual aesthetics. Now, the perfect example I have for this is when Tim is doing a battle report for his channel, Napoleonic Wargaming. He often spends more time dressing the table than we do actually playing the game, just to kind of, you know, in his mind, add that immersion for his viewers into the game to make it look better. Because we could just have a green battered board and a few bits just shoved on top of it, but he kind of tries to dress it in a much more unified look to make it look a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. Now, this isn't obviously something that everyone can do in their own kind of startup games, but having terrain that you have had an involvement in creating, whether it's just painting or even building, it adds you that kind of extra level of immersion and process in setting up your kind of spontaneous games that you have at clubs or at home or wherever it is that you might be gaming. So I think that is where I will draw the line for this discussion today. I will hopefully have an update in the next week or two of the terrain project that I have been currently working on, as the event itself is very rapidly approaching. I'm fleeing back to my happy place in the heart of Snowdonia for a couple of days to escape the manicness that has been work for the past couple of weeks, and just to kind of recharge and refresh so I can have that one final push to get everything done. And no doubt we'll come up with another half a dozen projects just from sites that I have seen on my travels. And then the constant dilemma that is my hobby brain going, oh, shall I, shan't I do this or do that? So we'll see where that takes me. But I will hope to see you in the next one.
Thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. Until next time, enjoy your hobby.